Canada just told the United States to keep its jets, and now nobody knows who is watching the Arctic. In the last 24 hours, details have emerged, confirming what analysts have suspected for weeks. Canada is abandoning its plan to acquire 88 F-35A stealth fighters, the backbone of the original Continental Defense Agreement, and replacing it with a dramatically downgraded mixed fleet, roughly 30 F-35As, and approximately 60 Swedish-built Saab Gripens to fill the gap. This is not a budget adjustment. This is not a procurement delay. This changes everything. Because the moment Canada announced it was replacing American jets with European ones, a seam opened inside the most important air defense network on the planet, and the United States is furious. This is geopolitical intelligence, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and share this, because what you are about to hear is already being discussed inside closed-door briefings that the public will not see for months. The story begins, as most defense crises do, not with missiles or armies, but with a decision made in a government office that looks completely routine on paper. Canada needed new fighter jets. That much everyone agreed on. The old CF-18 Hornets, workhorses that have patrolled Canadian skies since the 1982nd, are aging out. They cannot fly forever. The replacement program had been in motion for years, navigated through political turbulence, cost debates, and competing lobby interests. And then finally, Canada selected the F-35A, all 88 of them. The decision was meant to bring Canada fully into alignment with its American counterpart. Same platform, same sensors, same encrypted data links, same targeting architecture, one seamless continental air defense network. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which jointly operates with both the United States and Canada, was built on exactly that kind of integration. 2 countries, 1 system, 0 gaps. That was the plan. But the plan has just been torn in half. Now let's be clear about what's actually happening here, because this requires a level of technical understanding that most coverage is missing entirely. When we talk about the F-35A, we are not talking about a fighter jet in the traditional sense. Yes, it carries missiles. Yes, it flies fast. But the F-35A is, at its core, a flying sensor node. It is a data collection and distribution machine that can see radar-invisible threats, share that information in real time with other F-35s, with ground stations, with naval platforms, and with strategic command systems, all simultaneously, all encrypted, all instantaneous. The platform uses what is called the Multifunction Advanced Data Link, or MADL. It is a proprietary, closed architecture communication system, and that is where this story gets dangerous. Because the Saab Gripen, a capable aircraft, an honest aircraft, a jet that serves Sweden and several other nations effectively, does not use MADL. It cannot talk to F-35s the way F-35s talk to each other. It cannot access the shared targeting picture that American stealth platforms generate in real time. It cannot plug into the data fusion architecture that NORAD has spent billions constructing over the last decade. And that is not a software update. That is not a patch you download. That is a fundamental structural incompatibility baked into the hardware itself. Military analysts are already warning that if Canadian Gripens are scrambled alongside American F-35s during a real contingency, they will be operating with a fundamentally different and much smaller picture of the threat environment. The Americans will see things the Canadians cannot. And that seam, that gap, that blind spot in the Arctic of all places is precisely the vulnerability that adversaries spend decades and billions of dollars trying to create. But that is not the real problem. The real problem is where this gap exists geographically. Look at a map of the Arctic, not the way you learned it in school, not with the Arctic as an empty white void at the top of the world, but look at it the way a military planner looks at it. The Arctic is the shortest route between Russia and North America. It always has been. During the Cold War, American and Soviet bombers practiced flying routes over the polar ice cap because that is the straight line path between the two continents. Nothing has changed. In fact, the strategic importance of the Arctic has accelerated dramatically in the last several years. Russia has rebuilt and expanded its northern military infrastructure at a pace that has genuinely alarmed Western defense establishments. New Arctic airfields, new radar installations, new nuclear-capable missile deployments positioned precisely to exploit the northern approach. Intelligence reports suggest that Russia views the Arctic not as a frozen wasteland, but as its most viable pathway for both deterrence and, in a worst-case scenario, first strike. And Canada sits right in the middle of that approach. The Canadian Arctic is not a buffer zone. It is a thoroughfare. And the aircraft tasked with monitoring, intercepting, and, if necessary, defeating any threat coming through that thoroughfare need to be able to talk to each other instantaneously and completely. That is not an operational preference. It is a survival requirement. So here is what this change actually means. Canada proposes to station 60 Gripens in a role that previously would have been filled by F-35As. Those Gripens will fly Arctic patrols. They will intercept unknown contacts. They will respond to provocations. And they will do all of that while operating on a partially disconnected sensor network, able to see some of what their American counterparts see, able to communicate through some shared protocols, but fundamentally outside the closed-loop, real-time data architecture that modern stealth-era air combat depends on. Defense experts understand that in a permissive environment, routine patrols, peacetime intercepts, standard monitoring, that gap is manageable. But this is not a permissive environment anymore. The Arctic is heating up in every sense of the word, and in a contested environment, that gap could be decisive, not manageable, decisive. And this is where things get worse, because this is not just a technical interoperability problem. This is a diplomatic rupture dressed in aviation clothes. The United States has invested enormously in the F-35 program, not just financially, but strategically. The F-35 was designed from inception as an alliance weapon. It was built to bind allied air forces together into a single, cohesive, digital combat network. Every allied nation that operates the F-35 strengthens the network. Every allied nation that opts out weakens it. Canada was supposed to be an anchor node. 88 aircraft covering the northern approaches to the continent, fully integrated, fully interoperable, fully plugged into the shared picture. That is now reduced to 30 aircraft. And when Ottawa chose the Gripen over any other alternative, over the Boeing Super Hornet, over an expanded F-35 order, it sent a signal that Washington did not misread. It read it very clearly. Canada is choosing Europe over America, not militarily, not formally, not in alliance membership, but industrially, symbolically, and strategically. That is a different kind of message. And it lands during one of the most turbulent periods in the Canada-U.S. relationship in living memory. Let us be precise about what this moment represents historically. This is not the first time Canada and the United States have disagreed about defense. Canada opted out of the Bush-era ballistic missile defense program. There have been procurement disputes, policy tensions, burden-sharing arguments. But those were disagreements inside a framework of deep, unquestioned alignment. What we are watching now is different in character. Ottawa is not just declining an American preference. It is actively selecting a foreign competitor's product in a domain, continental air defense, where American and Canadian security are literally fused together. They share a command. They share airspace. They share radar networks. They share the response obligation. You cannot partially share a command and then unilaterally introduce equipment that the command's architecture was not built to accommodate, not without consequences. The reality is that military analysts are not the ones who are surprised by this. The ones who are surprised, genuinely, viscerally surprised, are the planners inside the Pentagon's Joint Integration Offices who have spent years building the assumption that Canada would be a full F-35 partner into every continental defense scenario they have modeled. 30 F-35, as instead of 88, means those models are now wrong. And when your defense models are wrong, you do not just revise a spreadsheet. You revise your threat assessments. You revise your deployment postures. You potentially revise your force structure. Military planners adjust, but they adjust with a quiet, burning frustration, because the adjustment was forced on them by a political decision made in Ottawa without their input and without, apparently, a full accounting of the second and third order consequences. And this is where something deeper reveals itself. Because the Gripen choice is not purely about aircraft performance or cost. Defense experts understand that when a sovereign nation selects a defense platform, it is not simply buying a jet. It is choosing an industrial partnership, a supply chain relationship, a maintenance dependency, and a strategic alignment signal. Canada's selection of the Saab Gripen is, at least in part, a statement of intent about which direction Ottawa is choosing to look. The Carney government has invested significant political energy in differentiating Canada from the United States, in presenting Ottawa as a distinct, independently minded Western actor, rather than simply a reflection of Washington's strategic preferences. The Gripen purchase is consistent with that political posture. It strengthens defense industrial ties with Sweden. It diversifies Canada's military supplier base away from exclusive American dependence. And it signals to European partners that Canada is a credible, sovereign participant in the post-American rebalancing of the Western alliance. All of that is coherent as a political strategy. The problem is that political coherence and military coherence are not the same thing. And in the Arctic, it is military coherence that keeps you alive. Let us walk through the options that Canada had and why none of them are clean. Option 1 was to proceed with the full 88 F-35A order as originally planned. This would have maintained complete NORAD interoperability. It would have reassured Washington at a moment when the alliance relationship needed reassurance. And it would have delivered Canada the most capable Arctic patrol aircraft available anywhere in the world. The problem is cost. The F-35 program is not cheap. Unit costs, through-life maintenance, and the infrastructure investment required to support a full 88 aircraft fleet represent a fiscal commitment that Canadian defense budgets have historically struggled to absorb. Critics argued credibly that Canada was committing to a program it could not fully fund without either cutting other defense priorities or accepting years of budget overruns. Option 2 was to select the Boeing F/A-18 Super Hornet as the primary fleet. This would have maintained a degree of American industrial partnership, provided familiar maintenance infrastructure given Canada's CF-18 history, and potentially come in at a lower per-unit cost than the F-35. The interoperability gap with American stealth platforms would still have existed. The Super Hornet also does not use MADL, but the diplomatic signal would have been considerably less provocative. Boeing is an American company. Selecting it would have been, at minimum, a commercially friendly gesture toward Washington. This option was assessed and set aside. Option 3 was a European-only solution, a full Gripen fleet or a full Eurofighter fleet. This would have maximized the European partnership signal, but would have left NORAD integration in even worse shape than the current hybrid proposal. Even the most generous reading of Gripen capabilities does not place it in the same operational category as the F-35A for the specific task of Arctic stealth threat detection and networked combat. A full Gripen fleet would have been commercially coherent, but militarily marginal for the most demanding end of the threat spectrum. Option 4 is where Canada actually landed, the hybrid, 30 F-35As and 60 Gripens. The political logic is clear. The F-35As provide the high-end interoperability anchor. The Gripens fill the volume requirement at lower cost and with better European industrial optics. Ottawa can tell Washington it is still in the F-35 program. It can tell Stockholm and Brussels it is a serious defense industrial partner. It can tell Canadians it managed the costs responsibly. On paper, it looks like a political masterstroke. In practice, military analysts are already warning that the hybrid introduces complications that neither a full F-35 fleet nor a full Gripen fleet would face. Two completely different aircraft types, two different maintenance ecosystems, two different pilot training tracks, two different logistics chains, two different software update cycles. The overhead of managing a bifurcated fleet is not merely administrative, it is operationally significant. In a crisis, when decisions happen in minutes, having two different platforms with two different capability sets operating in the same airspace under the same command is a coordination challenge that requires flawless execution. And crises are never flawless. Option 5, which nobody is discussing publicly, but which is quietly being modeled in defense circles, is the possibility that Canada, having committed to this hybrid, discovers within 5 to 8 years that the Gripen component of the fleet is not performing the Arctic mission at the required level. At that point, Ottawa would face a forced decision: expand the F-35 order at whatever the price is in the 2030 seconds, or accept a capability gap and manage it through alliance compensatory arrangements, which is another way of saying, ask the United States to cover the gap that Canada itself created. That is not a theoretical risk. That is the structural logic of the situation played forward in time. There is no good option here. There never was. Every path carries costs. The question was always which costs Canada was willing to accept. And the Carney government has answered that question in a way that prioritizes political and economic considerations over pure military optimization. Whether that is the right trade-off is a legitimate debate. What is not debatable is that the trade-off has been made, and it has consequences. The consequences are already rippling. Washington's reaction has not been restrained. American officials, speaking without attribution, because that is how these things work, have made clear that the reduction in Canadian F-35 purchases affects the Allied calculus in ways that go beyond the hardware itself. The United States has invested in NORAD modernization on the assumption of a fully F-35 equipped Canadian Air Force. The North Warning System replacements, the new Arctic surveillance infrastructure, the Joint Command architecture, all of it was designed around an assumption of complete Canadian interoperability. That assumption is no longer valid. Adjustments will have to be made. Resources will have to be reallocated, and someone will have to pay for the compensatory capability that Canada is no longer providing. In a Washington that is already debating burden sharing with extraordinary intensity, that conversation is going to be unpleasant. For Sweden, the story is obviously different. Stockholm has been working for years to expand Saab's international customer base, and landing a contract with a NATO member at this scale, in this geopolitical environment, is a significant commercial and strategic achievement. As a relatively new NATO member, having joined the alliance in 2024. Selling Gripens to Canada deepens Stockholm's integration into the Western defense industrial base. It gives Sweden a direct stake in North American continental defense. And it demonstrates that the Gripen can compete at the highest level for major alliance contracts, which strengthens Saab's competitive position for future competitions in Europe, in Asia, and across the developing world. For Stockholm, this is an almost entirely positive development. For Ottawa, the picture is considerably more complex. The Carney government has taken a calculated risk. It has chosen a defense procurement path that advances several legitimate political objectives: sovereignty, fiscal responsibility, European partnership, industrial diversification. While accepting a degree of military interoperability cost and diplomatic friction that is real, significant, and not fully priced into the public debate. Canadian defense experts who are critics of the decision are not wrong to identify the NORAD interoperability gap as a genuine vulnerability. Canadian defenders of the decision are not wrong to identify the fiscal and political constraints that made a full 88 aircraft F-35 commitment difficult. The truth is that both things are true simultaneously. Canada is making a reasonable choice under difficult constraints. And that choice has consequences that will play out across the next decade and a half in ways that no procurement announcement can fully predict. What this means, and this is where the strategic picture becomes truly sobering, is that the Arctic is entering its most contested period in history, with the primary continental air defense alliance experiencing a genuine capability seam at exactly the moment when the threat environment demands seamless integration. Russian Arctic military activity has not slowed. Chinese interest in Arctic shipping routes has not diminished. The geophysical reality of the polar approaches to North America has not changed. What has changed is that the alliance responsible for defending those approaches has just introduced a structural complication at exactly the wrong time. Intelligence reports suggest that adversaries who monitor Western defense procurement decisions, and they do with extraordinary sophistication, will have noted the Canadian announcement with considerable interest. A gap in NORAD integration is not something you exploit tomorrow. It is something you study, model, and plan around over years. The window between now and the point at which Canada's new fleet is fully operational and whatever compensatory arrangements exist are bedded in. That window is not trivial. It is measured in years, and years in strategic planning is not a short time. The truth is that what we are watching is not simply a procurement decision. It is a window into something much larger, the slow but accelerating divergence of political logic and military logic inside the Western alliance. The United States wants deep, seamless, technology-fused integration with its closest ally. Canada wants sovereign political flexibility and fiscal room to maneuver. Those two desires are not inherently incompatible, but when they collide in a specific decision about a specific piece of hardware in a specific strategic context, the friction between them becomes visible. And once visible, it cannot be easily unseen. Because the real issue is something deeper. The F-35 was never just a jet. It was a bet, a deliberate, enormously expensive bet by the United States that it could bind its closest allies into a single, technologically fused security system from which exit would be practically impossible. The logic was elegant. Make the platform so capable, so networked, so interoperable that no serious ally could afford to opt out without unacceptable military cost. For most of the F-35's partner nations, that logic has held. But Canada, uniquely positioned as both a geographically indispensable partner and a politically autonomous state, has just demonstrated that the bet is not unconditional, that there is a price point at which even the most essential alliance partner will choose a different path. And that is where everything breaks down. Not the NORAD network necessarily, not Canadian airspace immediately, but the assumption, the foundational, deeply held, never publicly examined assumption that the United States and Canada are not just allies, but effectively a single continental defense organism. That assumption has just been complicated, perhaps not fatally, perhaps in ways that are manageable, fixable, compensable, but complicated in ways that were not publicly negotiated, not publicly debated, and not publicly understood before those questions do not have clean answers. And that is precisely why they matter. Stay sharp. The story is not over. It is just beginning.